Okay, like my fellow panelists, I'm very grateful to the Woodrow Wilson Center and NBR for starting the National Laser Research Policy Program and inviting me to be a part of it. Unlike them, I'm not discussing a longstanding ally of the United States, but rather an emerging power in a country that the U.S. has had a very recent rapprochement with. And I certainly want to make the case here, looking at the impact of democratization on Indonesian foreign policy. I'll argue that shared democratic values have obviously been a key driver of this rapprochement, and that they provide a source of important cohesion for the relationship. But at the same time, democracy has opened up Indonesia's traditionally insulated policy process in ways that give those who oppose the U.S. and its policies a voice to drive foreign policy in ways that are antithetical to U.S. interests in some occasions. So since Indonesia is less well known to many in the room, my talk is a bit more of an overview of Indonesia's democratization, the key planks, and its implications for foreign policy in the U.S. As many of you know, since 1988, Indonesia has undergone a dramatic domestic transformation. A decade ago, the Indonesian economy collapsed during the Asian financial crisis. Social violence has erupted across parts of the country, and the 2002 Bali bombings illustrated that Indonesia faced a homegrown terrorist threat. At the time, analysts wondered whether Indonesia would become another Yugoslavia, a country long torn apart by sectarian and religious violence that would break apart. Instead, Indonesia managed to resolve its crisis. It's instituted one of the world's most effective counterterrorism policies, and the IMF is projecting 6% growth for 2010. And of course, Indonesia made a dramatic domestic transition to democracy that clearly illustrates that there's no inherent incompatibility between Islam and democracy. Now, having made these strides domestically, Indonesia has sought to raise its international profile. Indonesian leaders firmly believe that their experience transitioning to democracy, resolving conflicts peacefully, managing a terrorist threat, and overcoming an economic crisis give it the credibility to speak to many of today's global challenges, and the U.S. has clearly welcomed this and is currently negotiating a comprehensive partnership with Indonesia. Now, democracy has influenced both the substance as well as the process of policy making, and I'd like to discuss each of these in turn. Substantively, as Indonesia plays a larger role on the international stage, it's increasingly highlighting its status as a democratic Muslim-majority country. Today, new Islamic and democratic foreign policy planks have joined long-standing concerns with Third World solidarity and ASEAN and Indonesian foreign policy. And indeed, what makes Indonesia a rather unique international actor is its membership in these important global communities. It resides in Asia, but it's part of the broader Muslim world, the developing world, and the community of democracies, and its ability to navigate between these important constituencies is what makes it potentially such a valuable international partner. And since coming to power in 2004, President Yudhoyono has adopted a very cosmopolitan internationalist view that attempts to make good on these potentialities. With respect to the Islamic plank in foreign policy, Indonesia's key goal is to play a larger role in the broader Muslim world. Indonesia is seeking to promote an Islamic renaissance. Yudhoyono very often notes that Islam was once not only a religion of peace, but also a force for modernization, scientific process. He has argued that the Muslim world should embrace globalization, reach out to non-Muslims, and fight terrorism. Obviously, U.S. interests are served when the leader of the world's largest Muslim-majority country calls upon his Islamic brethren to embrace globalization and fight terrorism. Indonesia's ambition, however, to increase its role in the broader Muslim world is hampered by its traditional marginalization from it. Many Arabs view Indonesian Islam as second-class Islam, and few desire a stronger Indonesian role in global Islamic affairs. So its ability here, I think, is fairly limited. With respect to the new democratic foreign policy plank, this manifests itself in the Bali Democracy Forum and its efforts to democratize ASEAN. The Bali Democracy Forum aims to address Asia's democratic deficit by providing a venue where Asian countries can discuss best practices. To date, there's only been annual meetings. Indonesia is currently creating an institute that will hold intersessional workshops throughout the year on election organizing, political party development, institution building, i.e. all of the issues that Indonesia had to grapple with in the unexpected overthrow or the unexpected period following Suharto's downfall. Indonesia was also the prime mover behind the ASEAN Charter. This calls upon its members to adhere to the principles of democracy, rule of law, good governance, and respect for human rights. This marks a stark departure away from the organization's traditional adherence to non-interference. The Charter also created the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Now, Indonesia lobbied extremely hard for the Commission to be given the power to protect, not simply promote human rights, but it lost this battle internally. The Commission contains no provisions for citizens to petition the body, nor does it have the authority to investigate human rights abuses. So once again, although Indonesia's democracy promotion efforts are a boon to the U.S. interests, I think that these will matter only at the margins, and we only need to look as far as the reversal of democracy in Thailand or the efforts of the Burmese junta to ensure that the elections don't lead to real political change to see this. Now, turning to the process of foreign policy making, democracy has opened up what had been a very, as Kathy said, elite top-down insulated process, where under Suharto you had the president, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the military economic technocrats, and that was about it. Today, the presidency has been weakened, the military has lost its formal political role, Parliament has unprecedented oversight over foreign policy, and groups that were traditionally absent from these debates, political parties, Muslims groups, human rights activists, all actively participate in them. Suharto could adopt very unpopular policies, including capitalist-based economic policies, military cooperation with the U.S., in large part because he could suppress dissent. This is no longer possible today. Today, a vibrant press covers all government policies, and the political competition inherent in democracies gives opponents of the government an incentive to use its foreign policy goals to score domestic political points. Now, the U.S. obviously has an interest in Indonesia that continues to consolidate democracy, retain its traditional tolerant interpretation of Islam, keep its economy open, and adopt foreign policy consistent with U.S. interests. I would argue that none of these can be taken for granted. Democracy has opened up Indonesia's political process to a new constellation of actors, some of whom promote a radical interpretation of Islam, an almost xenophobic nationalism, advocate economic protectionism, and oppose cooperation on many issues important to the U.S. Many Suharto-era elites still retain significant influence and oppose reform. This was vividly illustrated recently with the departure of Finance Minister Sri Mulyani, arguably the country's leading reformer, at the hands of her nemesis Abu Daraz Bakri, one of the country's richest man who really, and the chairman of the Golkar Party, who epitomizes this kind of corrupt links between business and government. The day after Mulyani's departure, he was made head of the cabinet coalition. And this liberal cosmopolitan worldview that's espoused by President Yudhoyono has very fragile roots in Indonesia. And so whether or not we see both Indonesian domestic politics and foreign policy progressing in a way conducive to U.S. interests, I think is going to be a matter of which political actors win political battles. And here I just want to discuss a few issues where the opening up of the policy process has led to Indonesia taking actions that are antithetical to U.S. interests. On the Iran nuclear issue, when Indonesia was on the UN Security Council, it voted in the 2007 vote to impose sanctions on Iran for nuclear activities. This in turn triggered a huge domestic uproar. Islamic groups criticized the government for its breach of Muslim solidarity. Nationalist politicians, citing a phone call from President Bush to President Yudhoyono, accused the government of caving into pressure. Parliament used its powers of interpellation to compel the government to go to Parliament and explain this and really force the government to backtrack. The following year, in March of 2008, Indonesia abstained on the UN Security Council from the vote to tighten sanctions on Iran. It was the only member of the Council not to vote for sanctions. And Foreign Minister Nada Lagawa expressed regret over the recent UN vote to expand sanctions on Iran. So I think here we can see an instant where domestic politics has really driven foreign policy in one way. Democracy has also made it easier for economic nationalists to influence policy. Indonesians are deeply suspicious of capitalism. Yudhoyono's opponents used this in the 2009 elections by calling him a neoliberal. This is one of the most toxic labels in Indonesian politics. Indonesia maintains negative lists of sectors of the economy that are closed to foreign direct investment. Many Indonesian leaders have claimed that Indonesia could use a leader like Hugo Chavez, who would nationalize the country's resources and stand up to the West. Indonesia is currently on the USTR's priority watch list, and demands for higher content laws, a revision of production sharing agreements, etc., are all increasing. Indonesians oppose what they often view as double standards in the international economic arena, and the rise of economic nationalists to greater authority would clearly lead Indonesia to take more strident stances in international venues such as the G20. Democracy has always also enabled politicians to hijack debate on health issues. Indonesia suffered more deaths than any other country from avian influenza. Therefore, the country has a strong interest in the development of a vaccine against it. However, in 2007, Indonesia stopped sharing bird flu samples with the WHO. And while it did have a legitimate interest in whether it would be able to afford any vaccines developed from that, this issue got extremely politicized, with the health minister claiming that the U.S. and the CDC were using these virus samples to develop biological weapons. This was patently false, but it stuck. And it led, in part, in March 2010, to the Indonesian government closing the U.S. Naval Medical Research Unit. This is a biomedical research lab established in 1970 to research tropical diseases. It was only one of 2 labs in Indonesia that was certified by the WHO to test for avian influenza. Again, the health minister alleged that the U.S. had used Indonesians as unwitting guinea pigs for vaccines, and that it was involved in espionage. Now, that they would close NAMRU at the time that the U.S. was negotiating a comprehensive partnership illustrates the power of domestic politics to be mobilized in a way to lead to policies that would argue are antithetical to Indonesia's interests, to the U.S. interests, even when there's other larger interests at stake. So to conclude, I'd like to just say that I think that coverage of Indonesia in the U.S. often assumes that Indonesia's transition to democracy somehow automatically translates into a common foreign policy agenda and makes bilateral cooperation easy. I think that this assumption is not only false, but it's dangerous. And it's dangerous because in Indonesia's domestic political arena, too close of an association with the U.S. can be dangerous. And so I think that the challenge for U.S. policymakers is to ensure that their efforts to strengthen relations with Indonesia don't inadvertently end up weakening those domestic actors, reformers, who want to move Indonesia in a direction that the U.S. obviously supports. Thank you.